In the autumn of 333 BCE, the fate of two worlds collided on a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea, a place remembered in history as the battlefield of Issus. It was there that Alexander of Macedon, only in his early 20s yet already a conqueror of legend, faced the might of Darius III, king of kings of the vast Persian Empire. This confrontation was not simply a clash of armies. It was the collision of two civilizations, two leaders, and two visions of the future. The story of the Battle of Issus is not just one of tactics and bloodshed, but of ambition, fear, courage, and the turning of history's tide. To understand why this moment mattered so deeply, we must step back into the unfolding drama that brought the Macedonian king and the Persian monarch face to face. When Alexander succeeded his father Philip II in 336 BCE, few could have foreseen that within a few short years he would dismantle the Persian Empire piece by piece. Philip had laid the foundations by uniting the fractious Greek city-states under Macedonian hegemony, forging an alliance that would have launched a grand campaign against Persia. But Philip's assassination passed that responsibility to his young son, whose reign began under a shadow of doubt. Many considered Alexander too young, too inexperienced, and too reckless to rule an empire, let alone lead armies against the greatest power of the age. Yet Alexander moved quickly to assert his authority. He crushed revolts in Greece with ruthless efficiency, most famously destroying Thebes in 335 BCE as a warning to any who would challenge his rule. By the following year, he had assembled the Macedonian army and crossed into Asia Minor to fulfill his father's vision of conquering Persia. The campaign began with a test of fire at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, where Alexander led a daring cavalry charge across the riverbanks against Persian satraps and Greek mercenaries. Victory there opened the gates of Asia Minor, and within months Alexander marched unopposed through Lydia, taking the wealthy city of Sardis, and then to the Ionian coast, liberating Greek cities long under Persian control. Each step of his advance was not only a military conquest, but a political message. Alexander presented himself as the avenger of Greece, freeing Hellenic cities from Persian rule while simultaneously planting the seeds of his new dominion. By 333 BCE, the Macedonian army had pushed deep into Asia Minor. Alexander's reputation was growing with each victory, his charisma binding his soldiers to him in a loyalty that verged on devotion. The army was not large compared to the vast forces Persia could muster, but it was forged into a professional, disciplined machine. At its core stood the Macedonian phalanx, long spears bristling in tight formation, supported by elite cavalry, the companion cavalry led by Alexander himself, and seasoned light troops drawn from across Greece. Against this force, Darius III prepared to respond. The great king had initially underestimated the Macedonian incursion, allowing his satraps to deal with the threat. But the fall of Asia Minor and Alexander's steady progress made it clear this was no mere raid, but an invasion with existential consequences for the empire. Darius mobilized his armies, drawing upon the enormous resources of Persia. Soldiers from every corner of his realm were summoned: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, and contingents from as far as India and Central Asia. His army was not only vast, but symbolic of the empire itself, a tapestry of cultures and peoples bound by loyalty or fear to the throne of the King of Kings. With this force, Darius sought to crush Alexander before he could advance further, to remind the world of Persia's invincibility. The confrontation seemed inevitable, yet it came about in a manner both dramatic and unexpected. Alexander, after months of maneuvering, marched south from Cilicia into Syria, seeking to confront Darius in open battle. The Persian king, however, had advanced north with his massive host, aiming to outflank the Macedonians and cut off their supply lines. By a twist of fate, the two armies missed each other in the open plains. Darius then turned back and moved into the narrow coastal plain near the small town of Issus, effectively placing himself behind Alexander. The geography of the region, mountains pressing close to the sea, meant that the great Persian host was now trapped in a confined space, its sheer numbers unable to deploy effectively. This mistake would prove disastrous. When Alexander learned of Darius's position, he saw opportunity. Instead of retreating or seeking to outmaneuver the Persians, he marched north to confront them head-on. The Macedonian army, though smaller, would face the Persians in terrain that neutralized their numerical superiority. For Darius, however, the location seemed suitable. He arranged his forces along the narrow plain, anchoring his position on the Pinaris River, confident that sheer weight of men and the prestige of his kingship would overwhelm the young Macedonian. As the two armies prepared for battle, the stakes could not have been higher. For Alexander, victory would open the way to the heart of the Persian Empire, cementing his place not merely as a conqueror, but as a world shaper. For Darius, defeat would mean not only the loss of territory, but the shattering of royal authority. In the ancient world, the King of Kings was more than a general. He was the embodiment of divine order on earth. To lose in open battle against a foreign invader risked unraveling the very fabric of empire. Both men understood this. Both marched onto the field at Issus, not merely as commanders, but as figures upon whom the weight of civilizations rested. Under the fading light of day, the two armies drew near to one another. The Macedonians, hardened from months of campaigning, advanced with precision, their columns moving swiftly across the rough terrain. Each soldier knew that the moment they had been waiting for was at hand. They had followed Alexander across the Hellespont, fought at the Granicus, marched through Asia Minor, and now they stood poised to confront the very king of Persia himself. Alexander rode at the head of his companion cavalry, a shining figure in gleaming armor, his presence alone enough to stir courage in his men. He reminded them that they fought not merely for themselves, but for the glory of Greece, for vengeance against centuries of Persian invasions, and for the immortal fame that awaited them if they triumphed against the greatest monarch of the age. Darius, meanwhile, took his place at the center of his vast host, seated in a royal chariot adorned with gold and jewels, flanked by his elite guard, and surrounded by thousands of troops drawn from every corner of the empire. For him, the battle was not only a test of arms, but of legitimacy. He was the King of Kings, heir to Cyrus and Darius the Great, and it was unthinkable that he should bow before a foreign invader. Yet beneath the grandeur of his chariot and the banners of empire, there was unease. The narrow plain constrained his movements, his soldiers pressed together in a space too tight for maneuver, their numerical advantage reduced by geography. Still, he trusted that weight of numbers and the aura of Persian might would prevail. The battlefield itself was defined by the Pinaris River, a shallow but steep-banked stream running across the plain. Darius anchored his line along it, placing Greek mercenaries in the center, men experienced in the rigid discipline of hoplite warfare, while Persian infantry and cavalry stretched out to either flank. His left, toward the sea, was guarded by cavalry poised to sweep along the coastal road, while his right was drawn up against the foothills of the mountains. Behind the front line, massed reserves filled the plain, a seemingly endless depth of men. Alexander, approaching from the south, surveyed this deployment carefully. He knew that a direct assault on the Persian center, where the Greek mercenaries were massed, would be costly. Instead, he formulated a plan to strike where he was strongest, unleashing his cavalry on the flank, while trusting the discipline of his phalanx to hold the line against superior numbers. As dawn broke and the armies faced one another, the air was thick with tension. The Macedonian phalanx moved into position, each man lowering his sarissa, the long pike that bristled like a deadly forest of steel. To the left of the line, Parmenion, Alexander's trusted general, commanded troops against the Persian cavalry massed by the sea. To the right, Alexander himself prepared to lead the companion cavalry, his chosen place always at the point of greatest danger. Before the fighting began, he rode along the line, speaking to his men, urging them to remember that they fought not for survival alone, but for eternal glory. His words carried weight because he himself always shared their risks. There was no doubt that Alexander would be the first to charge, the first to break into the enemy ranks. The clash began with skirmishing along the riverbanks. Persian archers loosed volleys across the water, arrows whistling into the advancing Macedonian lines. The phalanx pressed forward regardless, shields raised, pikes thrusting as they descended into the riverbed. The banks were steep, the footing treacherous, yet the discipline of the Macedonians allowed them to push through. The Persians fought fiercely, their mercenary Greeks in particular resisting with the determination of professionals who knew their skills might decide the battle. For a time, the center of the field dissolved into a brutal melee, men grappling hand to hand, spears snapping, swords flashing, the cries of the wounded echoing over the roar of combat. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion found himself hard-pressed. The Persian cavalry, numerous and determined, surged against his position, seeking to overwhelm the flank and roll up the Macedonian line. The fighting there was desperate, with each side struggling for control of the narrow coastal strip. Parmenion held on grimly, his men fighting not for advantage, but for survival, knowing that if they broke, the entire army would be encircled. Alexander, on the opposite flank, saw this and knew that the fate of the battle rested in his hands. At the head of the companion cavalry, he charged toward the Persian right. The thunder of hooves shook the earth as the elite Macedonian horsemen swept forward in a wedge formation, their lances lowered, their king gleaming at the point. They smashed into the Persian cavalry with irresistible force, driving them back from the riverbank. Alexander pressed the assault, forcing his way across the Pinarus, his cavalry tearing into the Persian flank. The moment was critical. Instead of halting, Alexander wheeled his horse and drove directly toward the Persian center, aiming for Darius himself. In the chaos of the battlefield, the young king came within sight of the great king's chariot. For a heartbeat, the two leaders were close enough to see one another through the dust and turmoil. The sight of Alexander cutting his way forward sent shockwaves through the Persian ranks. Darius, unaccustomed to personal danger, felt panic grip him. His charioteer was struck down, and with Macedonian horsemen approaching rapidly, Darius lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled the field, abandoning his army in the moment of greatest peril. The sight of their king retreating shattered Persian morale. The vast host, so imposing at the start of battle, dissolved into confusion. Units broke and fled, pushing against one another in a desperate scramble to escape. The narrow plain that had confined them now became a death trap, with thousands crushed, trampled or cut down as the Macedonians pursued relentlessly. On the Persian left, the Greek mercenaries still fought stubbornly, but surrounded and leaderless, they too were eventually overcome. Along the coast, Parmenion's men, though battered, held firm long enough for Alexander's breakthrough to decide the battle. The rout was catastrophic. Darius escaped with a handful of followers, abandoning his family and royal treasures to the conqueror. Among the captives taken by Alexander were Darius's wife, his mother, and his daughters, all of whom were treated with unexpected respect by the Macedonian king. This act of clemency would become a hallmark of Alexander's image, contrasting his ruthless military genius with gestures of magnanimity that enhanced his reputation. For the Persian Empire, however, the defeat was a humiliation beyond measure. Never before had the King of Kings been driven from the field in such ignominy. In the aftermath of Issus, Alexander's star blazed brighter than ever. The victory was not merely military, it was symbolic. A young king from a small kingdom in the north had humbled the ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen. Across the Mediterranean and the Near East, The news spread like wildfire. Greek cities exulted, seeing vengeance for the Persian invasions of generations past. In Asia, subject peoples whispered that Persia's power was crumbling, that perhaps the invincible empire was no longer eternal. Strategically, the victory at Issus gave Alexander control of the eastern Mediterranean. With Darius retreating into the heart of Asia, Alexander was free to march south, securing the coastlines of Phoenicia and Egypt, cutting Persia off from its naval power. The road to the great confrontation at Gaugamela, the battle that would decide the fate of the empire itself, was now open. But Issus was the moment that announced Alexander not merely as a capable general, but as a force of destiny, a man who could bend the arc of history through sheer audacity and brilliance. For the soldiers who fought there, the memory of Issus would be etched forever in their minds. They had seen their king lead from the front, risking his life as much as any of them, and they had shared in a victory that seemed almost divine. For the Persians, it was a bitter scar, a reminder of what happens when pride blinds judgment, when numbers and wealth cannot substitute for leadership and resolve. And for Darius, the shame of flight would haunt him, undermining his authority even as he sought to rebuild his forces for one final stand. Issus, then, was more than a battle. It was a fulcrum of history, a turning point at which the balance of power between East and West shifted irreversibly. From the banks of the Pinarus River, the story of Alexander's conquest gained unstoppable momentum, carrying him onward to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and eventually to the very edges of the known world. Yet it was here, in that narrow coastal plain of Cilicia, that the legend of Alexander the Great was truly born, forged in the clash of spears and the collapse of an empire's illusion of invincibility.